Hello and welcome to the Last Word on Spurs. We are your award-winning Tottenham Hotspur podcast, and we are back during this, obviously not an international break, but a bit of a break for Tottenham Hotspur in regards to the fixtures at the moment. And we return with a feature special, one of two we've got this week on Last Word on Spurs, as we're delighted to welcome an author to the show in what is once again for us another book special on this Last Word on Spurs. I'm delighted to say joining me for this one, listen, glad to have him back. He's the voice of reason for many out there. It can be the one and only Jason McGovern returning. Jace, how are you?
Not too bad, mate, until I was reading about the 90s and then I suddenly brought back some horrific memories at times. But no, looking forward to this. Good book, this one. Very good book.
You've got on sporting now, Jace. I mean, there was a period there I was going to kind of bring it in as a big subject. Look, obviously for those that are listening and watching the show, obviously we're recording this show a couple of days after that defeat to Newcastle United away at St James's Park, where, I'll be honest, similar to the time we're going to cover on this show, was a time of a number of transitional seasons. Many would say it was a continual transitional era for Tottenham in the 90s, where there was lots of bumps along the road, similar, of course, to the nature of this season. But I'd like to think, trying to be positive, that we are in a better place now than we were then. And I'm delighted to say, joining us on this Last One on Spurs, author of this fabulous book, Is Gascoigne Going to Have a Crack? You know, we're delighted to welcome, making his debut, Gareth Dace to the show. Gareth, lovely to have you join us. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Ricky and Jason, and thanks so much for having me on. I've listened to your show for a number of years, and in part been inspired by some of the conversations that you've had and some of the guests you've had on previously. So delighted to be here today promoting the book.
Oh, listen, pleasure is all ours. Thank you for that. I'm not sure if me and Jason have been here when they've been inspiring conversations. Jace, what do you reckon? We've been on these shows?
Definitely not. Must have listened to one of Macca's halftime speeches.
Definitely one of Macca's halftime speeches. Listen, we are, like I say, very humbled by that, Gareth. Thank you so much. So look, just to give you a bit of background, obviously this book, forwarded by Julie Welsh, of course, Spurs in the 90s, Is Gascoigne Going to Have a Crack? You know. And I will say, look, we've been very lucky on Last One on Spurs over the course of the last 7 or 8 years when me and that man there, Mr. Jason McGovern, started this podcast, for whatever a better word, that it's been a real different type of journeys throughout different seasons. But I was born in the 90s. I say born in the 90s, late 89. And for me, the 90s really represents an era of a Spurs team you never knew you were going to kind of get week to week. So I want to start with you, Jace, if I can, because, look, for a lot of our newer listeners out there and viewers that have come to us through the times of Sonny coming to the club, you know, we've got a huge contingent base in Korea, a lot of Australian fans as well that may not be familiar with the 90s. Because what I will just say is that we're lucky and blessed to have a number of, or a huge amount of Australian fans that say, why are you guys so worried all the time? Why are you concerned? Trust in Ange. You're going to be okay. And I referenced in the last show that, unfortunately, a lot of the Australian fans that join us haven't maybe seen Spurs over the last 20, 25 years to understand the genuine pain, football in terms that we've gone through, and why we are so scalded as a fan base and panic at the time of every point of a transition maybe not going to plan. So for those contingent of fans out there, Jace, and for those that we've got a lot of younger viewers and listeners as well that weren't born in that era, can you try and sum up in about 60 seconds, Jace, what the 90s was like before we crack on with Gareth into this in more detail?
Well, the 90s, in some ways, lots of supporters would take back because we won 2 trophies. Started the decade with a trophy and ended the decade with a trophy. And if you measure a club by trophies, then it was the most successful period in our recent history. You could talk about it, bearing in mind what's happening in the 2000s. We had a few superstar players, but for me, it was a period with some real lows. 3 FA Cup semi-final defeats, managerial changes, and as always with Tottenham, loads of missed opportunities. But it was an era where, going into it, we were level pegging with Arsenal. We came out of it with a North London divide absolutely massive. We were always London's second club. We came out of that period very much as London's kind of third club, and if not, pretty much level as London's third/fourth club. There was financial problems constantly through the decade. We had a chairman that was deeply unpopular with most of the fan base. We had points deductions. We were expelled from the FA Cup. We had chairmen throwing players' shirts on TV. We had players' wives standing outside a court demanding the removal of chairman. I mean, that's the type of picture. But as I say, if you want your trophies, there'd be people that would take that decade back. But for me, the fact that we won 2 trophies doesn't forgive everything that happened in that decade. And like I say, we'll come on to it. It was a decade that my love affair for Tottenham was stretched to the minutest detail, if you like. So not a happy period for me, the 90s.
Well, there you go. A snapshot from
Me,
Jason
what we've had ever since.
A snapshot from Jason there about what the 90s were about. And I mean, Jason, before I bring Gareth back in, what would podcasts have been like in the 90s?
Well, I wouldn't have lasted, mate. I think I would have been like Troops or something like that for the 90s. And like I say, when we talk about chairman, the chairman then would have, that was a different level of chairman those days, that's for sure. Both of them, in many ways, the one that took us into the 90s and then the one that saw us through the 90s.
Look, great stuff. I mean, look, without further ado, Gareth, before we do open up, where can people find the book? When is it released? And yeah, how can we get our hands on the book itself?
Sure. Okay. So look, the book is officially released on the 22nd of April. It is available through the major retailers that you'd assume. So Amazon, Waterstones, WH Smiths. For anyone watching in the UK, though, you've got the option of buying it directly from my own personal selling site, which, on the screen you've got there, you can see my QR code in the top right corner. I'm pretty much price matching Amazon. But so if you're in the UK, you can get them directly through my own selling site. But otherwise, or alternatively, Amazon and Waterstones, WH Smith. Hopefully, if you walk in on there, you'll see them on the shelves pretty soon as well.
Lovely, amazing. Look, easy start to begin with. And can I just say, look, as always, I'm very blessed and lucky. Jason is the architect and the man behind a lot of these feature shows that we do. So for those that do ask in and say, what these incredible book shows are and how are they created, can I just say, give all the credit to Jason. Jason is the man that is the brains behind how these shows come together. Look, Gareth, we have to ask you this connection. Why Spurs? It's a question I've asked myself a lot in the last 20 years, I would say, in more detail after every game at times. But, without going into details of the book, what made you write it and what was that connection to Spurs? How did that form?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Spurs have been my team since 1988 was my moment when I first knew I was a Spurs fan. My dad was a Spurs fan back in the 60s. The picture of me and my dad. That was the first time I'd ever been on the pitch at White Hart Lane, actually. First time I'd been to the stadium. He was refereeing a staff game sort of behind closed doors. So that's about May 1988. And I went down with him as, what was I then? I was 7 years old at that point. And over that summer, Euro 88, I was slightly more aware of what was going on. I remember Marco van Basten's goal in the final of Euro 88. I had the Pete Panini sticker album that year as well. And so Dad made it very clear to me that Spurs were my team. I mean, I grew up not far from, I think, where you grew up, Ricky. So you'll know that it's a large Spurs area right at the bottom of Hertfordshire. Everyone, well, unless you were a glory hunter and supported Liverpool back in the day, you were Spurs or Arsenal. Really, there was a couple of QPR and West Ham fans around, but largely it was Spurs or Arsenal. And so Dad had supported Spurs in the 60s. He kind of stopped going when he started refereeing, but he was sort of keen to instill Spurs on me. I don't know why, because he didn't really have any passion for Spurs at that point, but Spurs were very much my team, and therefore the 90s were my formative years, both as a football fan and as a human being. I guess that was the period when I grew up. So I was 9 at the start of the 90s. By the end of the decade, I'd left school. I've started working. I was a grown up. I was an adult. So the 90s is sort of very much my period. I think it's always been an ambition of mine to write a book. I'm not an author by trade. I'm not a writer by trade, but I've always had this ambition. So it very much is a labour of love. And I started writing it for therapy. So for the same way that we can go and we can listen to Last Word on Spurs for therapy after games, I can almost probably pinpoint to the minute the moment that this book started, actually. And that was probably 2 minutes after Emerson Royal had been sent off at the Emirates in October 2022. and I threw the remote down on the floor and thought, sod this, I'm not watching this anymore. I thought I'm either going to start be at home swearing in front of my wife and kids, or I'll go upstairs and let me just start writing down some memories and some thoughts of the 90s, thinking I'll get writer's block after a sentence and give up. And, a sentence became a paragraph, and paragraph became a page, and a couple of pages became a chapter. I thought, there might be something to go on here. And it just flowed. So it just got me into flow state. I'd get up early in the morning. I think I'd just crack on writing a little bit more about that, or listening to some of the podcasts that you've done. I've got some of the books, literature I've got, to try and just repiece everything back together again. And before I knew it, sort of 3 months down the line, I had a 100,000 word manuscript and sent it off to a couple of publishers. And fortunately, Pitch Publishing responded to it, and that's where it started, and that was the process that I went on.
I just love the title of the book. Of course, Is Gascoigne going to crack? But the fact that when you look at the nature of Spurs in the 90s, magic, mayhem, mediocrity. What a play on the M's that is. I just think that's absolutely fascinating. Jace, you very kindly gave a very much brief illustration of what the 90s were about there. So I want to ask you, what did you make of that period?
It was just, the importance of the context is what we were in the decade almost before that, because state of football in the 80s, Liverpool and Everton were, you're right, Liverpool were winning most of the titles in the early 80s, but then Everton came along and put some serious heat on their Merseyside rivals. Tottenham and Arsenal were also battling like mad. So we were winning trophies at the start of that decade, winning 2 FA Cups, a UEFA Cup, into the Cup final 87, League Cup finals. Arsenal were challenging for the title at the end of the year, at the end of the decade with George Graham and such. They were coming strong. So the two centres were definitely there. And I think a lot of kids associated with Tottenham then is because the success we had, the glamour of Hoddle, Ardiles, Ricky Villa, the style of football we were playing through that period. Gazza came along towards the back end of the 80s. And Tottenham could go and when we think of what we are, when we think of it now, the signing of Paul Gascoigne that summer, I think we signed Paul Stewart first or something, was just for a British transfer record. We broke it a few days later with Gazza. If you think about that, Arsenal signed Declan Rice in the summer for 105 million or something. When would Tottenham break the UK transfer record now? But we did it twice in the space of 2 weeks, that going into the 90s. And that's how big a club we were. And we could go and sign a Gary Lineker from Barcelona at the end of the decade. We could become the first club really to go and sign 2 World Cup winners like Ozzy and Ricky. So, we could go to Liverpool and get Ray Clements, who was a top quality goalkeeper from them. So signings like that showed you where Tottenham were. And then you go into the 90s with all that optimism that you've built up. And we challenged for the I think the season of Shrewsbury 84, we were joint top of the league with 13 games left, of which nine of the 13 were at White Hart Lane and didn't win the league. So, that's when people think of the Poch era, how close we came to winning the league. That's the league title that I think got away from us that year. 9 of their last 13 games at home, and we're top of the league. And Mark, having just won at Anfield, which we never did. So, you take that into the 90s, and for all the things that should have come our way in the 90s, we finish it battling with West Ham as London's 4th club. And that just shows you the tail-off through that period. And it was a desperately disappointing period. Let's just put it that way, that's for sure.
Jace, we're going to stick with you. I'm going to hand over to you because you're going to start with the summer of 89.
Yeah, and that's a great thing, Gareth, isn't it? As we just mentioned, Gary Lineker, England's Golden Boot winner from a World Cup. He's gone to Barcelona, continued to score goals in Barcelona. And Tottenham go and sign Gary Lineker from Barcelona, England's greatest, at that stage, centre-forward. But the financial problems of that deal were already becoming, and there's the signs of what was to come through the 90s, wasn't there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know this from reading Irving Scholar's book, a really interesting book, Behind Closed Doors, that he wrote a couple of years after that. So, yeah, Lineker signed for us. And, Scholar was obsessed with having 3-star players. That's what he wanted to have. He thought every team Spurs team should have 3 outstanding attacking players. So at the point when Lineker signed in July 1989, he was going to be supported by Gaza, who we'd had a year of already, and Chris Waddle. So we all thought we had this front three of Lineker, Gascoigne and Waddle. And of course, that hope lasted less than a week, because then Chris Waddle was sold the week after that. It was a British transfer record for the amount.
And Lineker wanted a sign to stay with Waddle, didn't he? Chris Waddle was the driving force behind him signing.
Yeah, that's it. Well, yeah, absolutely. He said he couldn't believe his luck when he came there and thought, like, I'm going to have Gascoigne and Waddle supplying me. Again, yeah, that was dashed a week later. And through reading Irving Scholar's book, you realise that those black clouds were circling over the club financially at that point as well. Really, there wasn't. Lineker cost, it was £1.2 million, which in today's money sounds like absolutely nothing. There's probably players who earn that in 3 or 4 days around the world at the moment. But 1.2 million for Lineker, even then, that felt like an absolute snip. And Scholar said him and Venables were sort of laughing out the meeting room with Barcelona for getting Lineker for that much, and they got Naeem on a permanent deal as well. More on him to follow as well when we talk about cult heroes, I'm sure. But yeah, for the idea of England's best centre forward to come and be playing for Spurs, it just felt like something that Spurs did for all the reasons that you've suggested, all those examples you've given there, Jason. Having Lineker at Spurs, yeah, it felt like that's the sort of thing that Spurs do. And I think what was really apparent then, you spoke about the Liverpool team and the Everton team who were great, and the Arsenal team who tragically had won the league in 1989, and that's one of my worst memories as a young football fan, seeing them win the title at Anfield that night, as iconic as that is as a football moment subsequently. But what Spurs had, what was unique about Spurs, was that we were a team and we had those 2 or 3 superstars in the team. I think every great Spurs team has always had those magical players in them, whether it's because that they were the best in the business as strikers, or they were those really mercurial or talented midfield players or creators like Gascoigne. We had them, and with Gascoigne and Lineker, you felt this was just Spurs' DNA to have players like that and to build teams around players like that.
Interestingly, Gareth, the decade started with Spurs actually finishing third, pipping Arsenal on the last day to finish above them, winning away at Old Trafford, beating Liverpool, Arsenal, United at home, Gary Lineker scoring 26 goals. Things look really bright going into a World Cup that summer.
Oh, no, it did. You say we won at Old Trafford. We won at Old Trafford twice in the space of, I think, 7 weeks at the end of 1989. It took us 24 years to win there again after that, but we won there twice. We won 3-0 in the League Cup, and then we won 1-0. And this was the sort of the Fergie out days at United. You'll probably remember this, Jason. This is when Man United fans wanted Ferguson out, and of course he went on to win the FA Cup that year, and the rest is history. But we had a great season that year. Or at least we did at the end of it. We were slightly inconsistent through the middle of it. There were some dodgy results. We lost at home to Crystal Palace. We got beaten at QPR. But suddenly it all clicked into gear in about March time. And we went on, I'm going to say, championship winning form, because over the back end of 1990, which culminated in us finishing above Arsenal on the final day of the 89-90 season, we won at home to Southampton and they dropped points at Norwich. Which meant that we finished third in a day when third didn't really matter, did it? I mean, that's just the other context to take out of that. I was looking at this around that time. The teams that finished third, Nottingham Forest the season before us, the seasons after, Crystal Palace, Sheffield Wednesday, and Norwich did. So finishing third now feels like a really big deal, but perhaps there weren't as many dominant teams at the top. But anyway, we had a great run of form either side of that summer of 1990, which is important for other reasons as well. But from sort of March to November 1990, that I would say was the most consistent Spurs team of that decade, and probably we didn't see a more consistent Spurs team in the league until Poch's era. Yeah. I mean, it was 53 points from 24 games, so it straddled summer 1990. I mean, that's the equivalent of an 84-point season. And 24 games is a decent amount. That's 2/3 of a season.
And as you say, to go to Old Trafford and win twice. I remember I was up there for the League Cup game. I think Terry Fenwick might have broken his leg in the warm-up or something that night.
He did during the game.
Was it during the game? Yeah. I remember that. But we won 3-0, and then we went up there. You're right. And Gary Lineker scored, I think it's his only goal for Tottenham from outside the box in the 1-0 win at Old Trafford. He put it in the top corner. not at the Stretford end. What was in those days was the away end behind the goal. So that was two brilliant results. But you're right. I think that was when Ralph Milne and people like that were playing for Man United. So they weren't quite the Man United they were to become. And that's why I say, when we were talking about it, it was Tottenham and Arsenal, Liverpool and Everton where the four teams really starting to push, rather than Manchester United were you're right, trying to scream for Fergie's dismissal in those days.
Yeah.
And that World Cup summer, it was a brilliant World Cup, one of my favourite World Cups ever in Italy. We had that the fantastic game, I think, Germany-Holland, where in the San Siro, where you had three Dutch players who played for AC Milan against three Germans playing for Inter Milan. And they played a game in Milan. I mean, you couldn't believe it. What a brilliant, I think, Lothar Matthäus and his pomp. You had the Frank Rijkaard sent off, didn't it?
Yeah.
But it was just a brilliant World Cup. But England certainly played their part in that World Cup, no more so than the two Tottenham players, where Lineker got 5 or 6 in that World Cup again. Gazza was the shining star of the World Cup, although subsequently we know what happened in the semi-final. But when they came home from there, Tottenham were going into that season with a team that everyone wanted to watch. Lineker and Gascoigne back, Gazza mania in full swing, beating Man City on the opening day of the season. Gazza put in free kicks a couple of weeks later past Peter Shilton, even pointing to where he was going to put them before he took them. And I think he scored 3 free kicks that game because one was disallowed. And they made him retake it, and he pointed to the spot and put it in exactly the spot he'd done it just before it. I mean, that was Gazza scoring a Rabona penalty. And, of course, Gazza that season would take us all the way to Wembley, and what a season we'd go on to have. But going into that 90-91 season, actually third at Christmas, weren't we, Gareth? But we fell off incredibly, winning only 5 of our last 28 league games, although one of those with 9 men where Paul Stewart really became the midfield player that he went on to become.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you talk about Gazza there, and it's important just to mention that he transcended not just Tottenham and not even football. He was the absolute darling of the nation at the time. You think he was appearing on Wogan, he was switching on the Christmas lights,
top of the pops,
top of the pops. Yeah, he was even number two in the chart. Yeah, so everything he did, he was a national, if not international, celebrity back then, and it was largely all about his football at the time, and we saw the very, very best of him. I know Glasgow Rangers fans will say that they had good times with him up in Scotland, but yeah, that period around 1990 that I said when Spurs were in such good form, it was so much down to him.
And of course, it was the January of that season where the club's impending financial crisis that we'd known had happened over Lineker, but that was kept out of the papers. But the financial crisis really hit the news. And as the story developed, as that season went on, we knew that Gazza would probably be playing his last season.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, that was the case. I mean, I was 10 years old at the time, so you couldn't keep away from the story though, because it wasn't just on the front pages or the financial pages; it was on the back pages as well. And certainly there was a lot of scaremongering, and someone as young and naive as me at the time thought, well, look, Spurs could go bankrupt. There could be no Tottenham Hotspur in weeks or months to come. I mean, talking to other couple of people in the book who were perhaps slightly more aware, they always thought it was slightly fanciful, those suggestions that Spurs could be in any real financial problem, that in any sort of existential crisis. But certainly it was something that was always hanging over the club. And as we sort of later found out, the club's finances, they were effectively put into the bank's intensive care unit. That's how bad the finances were. I mean, it's in the book. I think Irving Scholar said it was something like £50,000 worth of interest every month was being taken off it. Such was the extent of the overdraft facility that they were using. So they've been too reckless in their spending throughout parts of the 80s, and it was coming home to roost then. And yeah, the club's most sellable asset, sadly, was Paul Gascoigne.
You know what's fascinating? I mean, I'll go back to this. Our last happy FA Cup semi-final memories, and Jason teed this up for me nicely. He knows me too well, as Jason. Was Arsenal. Obviously, that Arsenal's double was stopped. Though they lost just one league game, in securing the title that season. Gazza recovering from a hernia operation to play an hour. And that famous Barry Davis commentary line, "Is Gascoigne going to crack, the title of the book?" Gareth itself.
That's it. Yeah, I mean, I was at home watching. I think Jason, I think you were at Wembley, weren't you, for the semi-final? I was there for the final, but not for the semi. And I was there, a very, very anxious, 10-year-old, watching it upstairs in my bedroom. And almost the worst thing about going 2-0 up in 10 minutes against Arsenal was you knew what the next 80 minutes were going to be like, and it was absolutely horrendous 80 minutes watching it, because one of my first football memories have been them scoring that goal at Anfield in 89. So in my mind, and probably a little bit, it's still stuck with me now, it's, well, Arsenal always score late goals. So when it was 2-1 and they were peppering us, I think they hit the post at one point.
Yeah, Campbell, I think hit the post or something. Yeah.
Winterburn put one on the roof of the net. Yeah. And then, I mean, actually, our third goal there, the commentary for that is almost as iconic as the Gascoigne one. So Barry Davis talking about Lineker using Samways by not using him, because Vinny Samways makes this decoy run off the left, which takes the defender away. And, Seaman should definitely have saved Lineker's goal. But from talking to people that were there, and Jason, I'm sure this would have been the same for you, it was, once the elation passed of Lineker scoring, it was almost the relief of knowing we've got this 2-goal cushion and there's only about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, and I think actually on the day, we actually, second half, whilst they were peppering, we had quite a few break. I mean, Paul Allen, I think, had a couple of big breakaways. So you kind of felt that they were peppering us, but you kind of thought we looked more likely to get the goal kind of thing of 3-1. But it was a shocking error by David Seaman, or not a shocking error, but one that David Seaman, I'm sure, what a brilliant goalkeeper he was, will always feel we should have stopped Gary Lineker's one. It kind of squirmed through his hands. But and I always remember they had to come to our end of the stadium, because obviously the tunnel used to be at the end of the stadium, not on the halfway line. And as they came towards our end, all you could hear was, "Where's your double gone?" At Arsenal, and the taunting of them. And they just had to suck it all up with Gazza, with his famous drinking celebrations and that. And it's I think for those of us that day, I'm probably right. I can remember the semi-final more than the final. Beating them meant more to me than winning the final. It stopped their double. It was just, it was the first Tottenham Arsenal semi-final. It was the first ever semi-final to be staged at Wembley, because we'd always had to go up north before that, or go to Villa Park or somewhere. So it felt quite a unique occasion. And the fact that we were at Wembley, don't forget, Wembley in those days was purely for cup final use. Nothing else. No other club games were going on at Wembley. So it had that feeling already of being the cup final. And I suppose the hardest thing to do was to come down from that and realise that we hadn't actually won the cup that day. You still had a final to play against Forest. But like I say, the semi-final, the elation of that semi-final was more so than it was in the final itself.
Yeah, so, well, for the book, I spoke with David Howes. He was very generous with his time, and he was a very key part of that team. And he told me that particularly Gary Mabbott and Paul Allen, who had been part of the '87 Cup final team that so tragically lost against Coventry, he said they were very, very quick to say, kind of in contrast to what you just said there, Jason, but that was the semi-final. Whatever you do, don't now go and lose the final. The final is the important one there. So they were very well grounded, because they had two very good senior pros in the team who kept them grounded and didn't let them get carried away with the semi-final win. Well, as we as supporters, absolutely we did, and quite rightly so. I still dine out on that one now.
And I think the final, in a strange way, sums up how football goes full circle sometimes. That we'd lost in '87 to a Gary Mabbott own goal, and we win it in '91 where Gary Mabbott forces an own goal from Des Walker. And that just shows you sometimes football goes full circle, and fate comes along and thinks, do you know what, this time I'm giving it to you. Or it went against you once before, and it's about time it came our way again, I must admit. But that just sums up football for me that day.
Yeah, it did for me as well. And I think even as a 10-year-old watching that, sometimes you watch a game and you just know it is going to be your day or it isn't going to be your day. And it just felt as the game progressed that day that despite all the adversity of Gazza going off on a stretcher and Forest going 1-0 up, and then having that goal disallowed, which should never have been disallowed for offside. Crossley probably should have been sent off under the interpretation of the laws back then as well. And yeah, I mean, again, David Howells told me Venables' team talk at half-time was excellent because he said to the players, look, you're under no pressure here. If you don't win, people will say it's because Gazza was injured and wasn't there. And if you win, it's because of you. So he said he was incredibly calm with them. And second half, again, yeah, just one of those days.
And can I just say, such as the elation of that. Go, James. Go.
Yeah, go on. Say what you was going to say, Rick.
Yeah, I was going to say, such as the elation of that day. Look, I was only 2.5 at the time, but from what I've been told, I smashed the French windows in the house. So that was a firm ground in that I was definitely going to be Spurs. Even at that time, I didn't really have a choice. And I was still, at that time, just showing how much I love the FA Cup.
I was going to say, was that Dad throwing you through the window or something?
Might have been. Go on. I'll hand back to you, Jace. Go for it.
We had, of course, the last bus ride through the streets of Tottenham. That was brilliant on the Sunday. But the summer, as it became on, was dominated by the off-field problems. The potential sale to Irving Scholar or then Robert Maxwell was involved. Robert Maxwell was a media mogul in those days, owned the Daily Mirror, very much the opposite to Rupert Murdoch. But whilst Venables was hoping to form a consortium with Alan Sugar, Robert Maxwell, of course, had already helped Tottenham financially and looked in pole position to take control of the club.
Yeah, well, again, that's something that came out afterwards. It's in Scholar's book, and even Sugar references it as well. That Robert Maxwell was I'm going to say, a controversial character even back then. He was certainly larger than life, but he was probably was he the favoured bidder or not? I don't know, but he had a lot of bluff about him, as of course it became well known several months afterwards when he died. But he was talking about if he took over Spurs, he'd be able to keep Gascoigne. So I think Scholar favoured a sale to Maxwell because he felt that would enable Spurs to keep Gascoigne at the club. But Venables has spent a lot of time, which is where you talk about those 5 wins from 28 league games towards the second half of that season. That's because Venables was very rarely on the training pitch. The players didn't see much of him because in his role he was going out there and he was trying to find a bidder to go into business with, because it was always his ambition to run a football club. He'd had a director's role at QPR several years before that. But he was very, very keen on taking over the club and finding someone to go into partnership with. There was talk, I forget the name of the fellow. I'm sure I think I've written it in the book. Who were talking about buying it and then selling the ground, or buying the stadium and then leasing it back to the club. So there are all these sorts of, I don't know if you call them pie in the sky ideas that are out there. But Maxwell seemed like he was the most credible one, and certainly one of the more popular bidders at the time.
Maxwell, of course, was chairman of Oxford at the time. Yeah. So you couldn't possibly be chairman of two football clubs, and he already had one. But the sale eventually went through to the Sugar Venables consortium, and given what then transpired with Maxwell, it was probably just as well that deal went through.
Wasn't it just? So Robert Maxwell died, was found washed ashore in that November 1991. Supposedly this head of this huge multi-billion consortium, which was proven to be, it's built largely on a stack of lies. So that money wasn't there. So God only knows what would have happened had the club fallen into his hands at the time. And yeah, as you can see on the screen there, Alan Sugar took over. So he and Terry Venables had a very, very brief relationship. So Terry Venables had advertised one of his Amstrad, I think it was a fax machine, a couple of years before. And so they knew each other, not very well, but they knew each other well enough. And this is in Sugar's book. He said that his children sort of alerted him to the fact that Spurs were in trouble and they were sort of nominally the family team, and would it be something he'd be interested in doing? And he made a couple of phone calls, spoke to Terry Venables, and it was that fateful day in a meeting room with Irving Scholar and Paul Bobroff, who was the sort of co-chairman of the club at the time, when Sugar convinced them that Maxwell was full of hot air, and Sugar opened his suitcase up and he had a banker's draft in there for £3 million in his pocket. And that was the difference between Sugar getting the club and Maxwell getting it.
Amazing.
What could possibly go wrong from there?
And then Alan Sugar, I suppose, he realised football had to be run as a business, which nowadays, we would all criticise clubs for spending money that they didn't have, but in those days it was a different environment, and we were soon had the first impressions of that with the summer signing of Gordon Jury from Chelsea, where Alan's more stringent spending controls were already starting to come to the surface.
Yeah, well, it was a sign of things to come. So my chapter for that season, 91-92, is managing the 11, because Venables and Sugar were seen to be the dream ticket. Venables would manage the 11 on the pitch, and Sugar would manage the £11 million overdraft. So it was very clear that Spurs couldn't buy any players at all until they sold them. So Sugar had this conversation with Venables. He went off on holiday to Spain. Venables had spoken about Gordon Jury at Chelsea, and Venables said, "Well, we can't buy him until we've sold any." So Sugar, in his book, tells the story about getting the phone call when he was on a holiday saying, we bought Gordon Jury. And he said, "Well, who have we sold then?" To be told, "Well, we haven't sold anyone." So that was within weeks of that partnership taking over. And that was, again, it was a sign of things to come. There was another story that, of course, we played in what was then called the Charity Shield, now known as the Community Shield. Sugar went to Wembley, one of the first football matches he'd been to, certainly the first one as a chairman of the football club. Took his tickets and sort of was asked by one of his confidants, "Well, why are we sitting here, Alan? Why aren't we sitting in the Royal box?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. These are just the tickets I've been given." So he then found that Venables and his sort of family and friends had taken over the whole of the Royal box in there, and Sugar was there stuck in I don't say quite with the plebs, but he wasn't in the director's box where he should have been, above the halfway line. So that was
Jerry Arsenal, don't forget, as well.
Yes, yeah. So it was a sign of things to come. I mean, both of them completely misunderstood each other, and I don't think took each other seriously. I think Sugar took over the club thinking that Venables was this brilliant football genius who he would just let run the football side of things, and Venables thought, "I've got someone in here who's gonna back me and let me get on with it." Whereas, of course, they were both power crazy in their own particular ways, and a clash was completely inevitable, unfortunately.
It was indeed. It was. Now, it became a season in which we flirted with relegation, and not for the first time that decade. Going, I mean, if this was today and we were doing podcasts in this world, 11 home games, Gareth, without a win.
Yeah, we were horrific at home that year, and the two must be connected. Jason, do you remember the state of the pitch that sort of winter and early spring in 91-92?
I just remember every pitch seemed to be. I mean, Derby's was the worst pitch of the lot. Was any time you see pictures now of Derby, it's literally just a cow field. But yeah. You put up the picture earlier with your dad there. With no grass in the centre circle. There you go. Look at the state of the circle. So, but I think that was an era where many pitches, as the season ended, you kind of get the triangle in the goal mouth, didn't you? Most teams where it was just mud in the goal mouth and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, ours was particularly bad. And I always remember this from my end of season VHS, and look that up, kids. That was a thing as well. That was my Christmas present every year. But I can remember listening to the commentary they used for one of the game, and the commentators were actually saying that, well, they know there's a problem. There's disease within the soil at the moment. So it was even worse at Tottenham that year than anywhere else. So our away form was better than our home form. But I guess a bit like the previous season, that 91-92 season, league form went out the window as we chased cup competition. So we had, I mean, the FA Cup, unfortunately, we fell at the first hurdle. We were unfortunate that we got drawn against a very good Aston Villa team. And despite getting a good draw up there, we took them back to White Hart Lane and got beaten fairly narrowly. But the League Cup, we got to the semi-final and were beaten by Nottingham Forest on, if you remember that day, the game was delayed because of a bomb scare. It kicked off an hour later than it should have done. It was absolutely torrential rain. Yeah. And then we also had this foray into European football as well, which was really important. That was why winning the FA Cup was supposed to be so important, because of the revenue that would generate by having a European campaign. And we got to the quarter-final, and we were, again, I think, very unfortunate. It was a real flip of a coin tie against Feyenoord, who, of course, we had history from, having played them a couple of times previously, and went out 1-0. But all the focus really went on the cup competitions. Fortunately, I mean, there was a hint of a relegation scare, but we'd probably got enough points at the start of the season when we actually started quite well that relegation was never really a fear, or at least in context of what we had a couple of years after that anyway. But 91-92 felt very much an end of days sort of time for us. Venables was very removed from the first team. He was the chief executive. Peter Shreve had come back in and was running the team. And again, talking to David Howells, he has a lot of time for Peter Shreve, but always had reservations about him as a number one, as a number two, and as assistant. He thought he was brilliant. But real sort of end of days about that season. And of course, that was the last Football League season as well. So 1992 and the revolution that became about what was going on in England and around the world really came to fore.
I have to pick up on something Gareth said there, and this is why, again, with a lot of people that are born in and around the 90s, that they do this a lot, even at the start of the seasons now. We actually count to see if we've got enough points that we are going to stay up, rather than focus on any other goal about what we could achieve.
Points.
Get to 40 points. Get to the 40 points. As long as we've got the 40 points, we know we're safe. I still see that these days from a lot of the older school fans that are around the 90s, such as what this era has schooled in us. Believe me, it did happen. It's crazy. Kids listening to this won't believe it. It's
in
true,
fairness, you can't get to 80 points until you've gone past 40 points. So you've got to get to 40 points.
It's true. Look, Jace, two parts to this. Two big names in our history left in that summer, didn't they? And also 1992, as Gareth touched upon there, saw the beginning of the Premier League. And Alan Sugar was a huge driving force behind that television process.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, going into that decade, we were signing big players, and that summer we lost Gascoigne and Gary Lineker, albeit for reasons that they didn't just walk away from the club. I mean, Gazza had got injured in that cup final, and his sale was agreed, but then because of the injury he got, the sale actually didn't go through to Lazio until that following summer, and Gary Lineker was coming towards the end of his time, and he went off to play in Japan. So they weren't necessarily two big sales like the Teddy Sheringham sales and the Dimitar Berbatovs and things like that of today's era was, but they were still two superstar names that were leaving Tottenham that summer. And you're right, that summer saw the start of the Premier League. For me, Alan Sugar's real interest in Tottenham was based around that, knowing that the Premier League era was starting to come. Alan Sugar was producing satellite dishes for Amstrad. And of course, if B-Sky B, what was the company then, won the rights to the Premier League, and everyone went out and bought a satellite dish, then Alan Sugar's sales of his satellite dishes would go up hugely. And so they go into a bidding process, a secret bidding process between the league chairman and the media companies. Sir Alan has a look at one bid, or it becomes apparent what one bid is, and he decides to make a phone call to Sky to alert them, you better come and make a bigger bid and blow ITV out the water. And sure enough, Sky did that. And on the back of that, Sir Alan was able to sell a lot of his Amstrad dishes. So, when you blame what Sky have become and the things that they do to the fixture list and the inconvenience they put to fans, don't forget it was our chairman that played a major part in Sky becoming the broadcaster that they did. Is that a fair summary, Gareth?
Yeah, and everything you said there is well documented. I don't think there's anything sort of controversial about that. It's what happened. I mean, he would say, and I think with some merits, that ITV, who were the terrestrial broadcaster who'd covered the Football League for the last 4 years, were paying well under the odds. They weren't paying what was going to be the market value for an incredible, I'm going to hate use the wording product. So it was 44 million over 4 years. So 11 million a year that was split between 92 league clubs. But Sugar was the one. So we talked about that big five, that sort of cartel of Arsenal, Liverpool, Everton, Man United and Tottenham. The other four chairmen were all pretty much in bed with ITV and Greg Dyke at the time. So Sugar was really the outlier there. So I guess give him some credit for having that foresight for football as an industry to look beyond what they knew and were comfortable with at that point. And I guess but
none of those other four chairmen had satellite dishes to sell.
Maybe, yeah.
And after some high-profile departures over a few seasons, Teddy actually arrived at the start of the Premier League era. I think he kicked off the season with Forest, didn't he? I think he scored.
Did, yeah. He scored the first goal on Sky's Super Sunday,
Yeah. And we followed Teddy's signing with players such as Andy Gray and Jason Cundy coming to the club. And if you listen to TalkSport, how Jason Cundy has ever played for Tottenham, I don't know. But the iconic game actually of that season, which I remember well, was going up to Main Road in an FA Cup tie, Mayhem scoring a hat-trick and a pitch invasion. Terry Phelan actually scored a brilliant goal against us. I think Teddy was advised it would be better if he missed a penalty that day as well. It was a crazy game, but what an iconic game it has gone on to become.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, we talked about beating Man United 3 times in 89-90. We beat Man City 4 times that season. We'd also beaten them in the League Cup. There's a game I went to in October. We did the double over them in the league as well. And yeah, I mean, that FA Cup game, I remember it. I mean, FA Cup was on the BBC that year. So it was a really big deal to be able to see your team playing live. And that was probably one of my most favourite Spurs teams for a very short period, that team of Sheringham. And we signed Darren Anderton the summer before as well. And what a great player he was, probably on a consistency level, our best player of the 90s. But Sheringham, Anderton and Barmby, the 3 of them in attack, we'd really found a formula, I think, that worked there between the 3 of them. They worked so well together. And then you had players like Naeem, who sort of came in and out the side as well. We had a really good defensive unit. So Neil Ruddock, now people will probably be aware of him. Now, I think he's recently lost a lot of weight, hasn't he? But he was perhaps famous for being incredibly overweight. But we had a really good season out of Neil Ruddock that year at the back. It felt like we'd finally got that hard man at the back of defence who had sorted out his discipline as well. And that team seemed really, really well balanced. And it really felt like this was a team that was gonna go somewhere. It was a young team, had a good manager, and that game at Man City, I guess, really was encapsulated everything that was good about that team at the time.
Can I just say, Gareth, you're going to have to forgive us because we have got a very famous message from you calling into dialing into teletext. And for the viewers, for the younger listeners, we've already lost you. For the younger viewers and listeners, we've already lost you. For those that were again around in the 90s, they know exactly what we mean by, of course, teletext, CFAX at the time. You'll have to tell me when you want me to bring that into the show because
Sure.
A lot of the nature of that teletext message is quite fascinating when you consider the team you're talking about and where they are now in comparison to your mention of them all those years ago. And I just will quickly, if I can, just come over to Jace because the season, Jace, on that one did end with a 3-1 win at Highbury. Our final win there and just one of 2 in the 31 years of the Premier League away to them. Just when I read that, it's just absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, that win, though, saw John Hendry write his name into folklore, but Woolwich, of course, were preparing for the FA Cup final just days later, and they won both domestic cups that season, Jace.
Yep, and they beaten us in the semi-final, and as much as we'd enjoyed beating them in 91, they got their revenge 2 years later with a Tony Adams header. We should have had a penalty on the day, but, it didn't happen. But they were a better team than us. They'd won the League Cup that season, beat Sheffield Wednesday. Their winning goal scored by Steve Morrow, whose celebrations were ruined, I think, by Tony Adams by dropping him off his shoulder and breaking the bloke's collarbone, and he ended up being stretchered off the pitch before he could go up and lift the trophy. But they ended up beating. I think they beat Sheffield Wednesday in both finals.
They did, yeah. Chris Waddle, Sheffield Wednesday, yeah.
Yeah, but we went to Highbury, I think, on the Monday or the Tuesday night when they were going to be in the cup final. So it was a much changed Arsenal side. But you're right, it was the first year of winning at Highbury in the Premier League, and we've won there just once ever since. And, I think our record at Stamford Bridge is always well talked about. But actually, our record at Highbury is just as shocking, really, and just that Unisca ball ever since. So, it's another one we've got to sort out at some stage or other. But the fallout off the pitch really reached an ugly conclusion that summer, didn't it, Gareth, with court cases when Terry Venables was sacked, who'd become chief executive by Alan Sugar. Then the judge overturned the decision and Venables was reinstated. Then Alan Sugar appealed the decision and went back to court, and it was upheld this time, the decision. We had players' wives outside the court supporting Terry Venables over Sugar. We had protests outside Sugar's home. We had banners up saying we want tea, no sugar, for tea for Terry Venables. It was quite a summer, wasn't it? As Tottenham once again dominated front and back pages for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, unfortunately. So as I said, we'd built this team up there and with Terry Venables at the head of it. He was chief executive of the club, but he was more heavily involved in the coaching side and the recruitment of players. And of course, so many of those players were really, really loyal to Venables, that they all absolutely adored him as a coach, and as a man. He generally got the best out of them as well. So we thought we were really onto a good thing. But of course, this was going on, and the examples that we gave earlier in those early days between Sugar and Venables led you to believe there was only ever going to be room for one of them. And I was heartbroken when Venables left. So my personal anecdote is that the following, that was maybe the Thursday or the Friday, when it just came out of absolutely nowhere that Venables had been sacked. And I just assumed, as a naive kid at there, Venables would be our manager forever. I thought he would be our Alex Ferguson, who'd won the title that year. And the following day, my dad was refereeing one of the academy under 15s games for Spurs at the old training ground at Mill Hill, and I turned up with my A4 bit of paper scribbled on it in capital letters, Sugar out on it, and held it up to absolutely nobody. But that was my own personal protest at the time. But it was a really unedifying episode for the club. As you said, it was always the front page news. It was over all the evening news as well. These court cases with angry mobs of supporters outside the High Court, literally spitting and swearing at Sugar, and people, including Neil Ruddock's wife, turning up outside his mansion in Chigwell with signs protesting as well. And the court cases went both ways, but ultimately Sugar came out. And I hate to say it as a football romantic who loved Terry Venables, but sadly it was probably the right choice at the time, totally for non-footballing reasons. I hasten to add, but the two of them were never going to coexist as owners of the club and running the football club.
And that summer progressed. I think Alan Sugar, realising he needed to perhaps he read the room a little bit and think, I better get some popularity back. So he actually appointed Ozzy Ardiles as a manager that summer, with Stevie Perryman coming back as his assistant.
Yeah, he did. So there were two names in the hat, really, and it was going to be a club legend either way. It was either going to be Ozzy or Glenn Hoddle. So Glenn Hoddle had done incredibly well to get Swindon promoted as player manager, but he had already verbally agreed with Ken Bates that he'd go to Chelsea sort of just before the Venables thing happened. So he was committed to that. And yeah, you talk about Alan Sugar as the chairman as a force of nature. Ken Bates is something else. So he wasn't quite brave enough then as someone in his early 30s to turn around to Ken Bates and renege on that deal. So and Hoddle always said that he felt it wasn't quite his destiny at that point to come to Spurs. He would always go there, but he felt it was a little bit too early on. So Ozzy was the clear front runner for it. I mean, I was looking back at Ozzy's managerial record at that point. He, in theory, had got Swindon promoted in 1990, but then Swindon had been docked points because of some irregular payments to players, which is, just hold on to that thought list, because that's something that may come up again. Not Ozzy's fault, definitely not. So Swindon, had, instead of going into the first division in 1990, had ended up in the third division, because they'd been relegated as a punishment. But his managerial record, there was nothing special about it beyond that. He'd gone to Newcastle, who were struggling at the bottom of Division 2 and didn't really there was an immediate bounce, but he was sacked within 12 months and Keegan took over at Newcastle. He'd gone to West Brom in the third division, and I think he'd got West Brom playing quite nice football, and third division football was pretty meat and potatoes at the time. And he'd got them promoted, and he got the job, I would say, off his reputation as a player with Spurs, not because he was sort of a brilliant manager who had a fantastic track record at that point. It was very much a hope that he could transfer what he'd done, and just the romantic notion of Ozzy Ardiles and everything that he stood for could translate itself into becoming the manager.
And where we were as a club then is highlighted by the signings in that season of Colin Calderwood, Jason Dazelle, and then as the season progressed, David Kerslake and Kevin Scott. There's some legendary names in Tottenham's history, isn't there? And actually, despite a bright start under Ozzy, injury to Teddy Sheringham at the same time Gordon Jury was sold totally left us without a striker, and which hence why I think Kevin Scott might have come in on loan, didn't he? Or was it Kevin Booth came on loan? I think in Pleat's era. But Kevin Scott might have been a proper signing, thinking about it now. But
Kevin Scott was. I mean, I was at that game at Old Trafford in October. We went there in really, really good form. United were the champions. We went to Old Trafford, and Brian Robson just kicked Sheringham out of the game. In fact, kicked him out of the season, really, because it turned out that I think it was cartilage problem, which then became a ligament injury. We were always told he was only a couple of weeks away, and weeks became months. And yet the form absolutely nosedived once he went out. We couldn't score any goals. There were players playing out of position, and then we hit a really rocky period in early 1994.
And then as the season went on that year, we lost 7 games on the bounce. So, when we've just lost 4-0 at Newcastle, here's a run of 7 games with 7 straight defeats, which culminated in a crazy game of all places at Chelsea, which we even had crazy games with Chelsea back then.
Yeah, and who was the Chelsea manager?
Glenn's their manager. A former Tottenham man's in their bench. This is not sounding too good with a few weeks to come. We're 2-0 up, then we're 3-2 down, then we get back to 3-3, then we miss a penalty to put us in front, and then we concede a penalty in the last minute, which I think it was Mark Steen scores, and we lose 4-3. And that match culminates in a relegation clash at Oldham that season, where Tottenham Hotspur go into match day 37, 1 point above the relegation zone, to an Oldham side that are in the relegation zone. But of course, a win that day, I think, for Oldham puts them above us and Tottenham into the trapdoor going into the last day of the season. So what a scenario that season became.
Yeah, and then that result at Oldham, that performance was probably one of our best of the season. Actually, it was the rain was torrential. The game was in doubt. It could well have been called off at some point during the afternoon because the pitch was in such a bad condition. And again, David Howell told me they had a really, really positive mindset in there. For all the bad things that we'll say about Alan Sugar, but he said that Alan Sugar got them in a team meeting sort of in the days before the game, and I don't even think Howells could remember particularly what he said, but it was just his manner, and he was very confident that they were going to be all right. And Howell said we went there, and our motivation was that we knew if we won that game, it sent Oldham down, and that saved us. So he said that was their motivation. When I actually watched the footage of it recently, you think a really heavy pitch like that, they would just play it long up to Teddy and he'd win flick-ons, which he was capable of doing. He was a very clever player on the ground, but he could do that as well. He had his schooling at Millwall, didn't he, playing up front with Cascarino before that. But we played really, really nice football that day, and we scored 2 lovely goals, one of our own, Vinnie Samways, and Howells himself scored the second one. And that was the point when we were saved, as you said, penultimate game of the season, the 5th of May. And, tragically, I mean, to talk about the North London divide, the day before that, Arsenal had won the European Cup Winners' Cup. And there we are going to Oldham to stay in the Premier League.
Maybe I am glad that I wasn't actually formidable in that period. I knew less about Spurs. And we weren't doing podcasting back then, Jason.
We've just lost a game and we're now 5th in the league.
Crazy, isn't it?
Think about it.
I always say that, when you talk about this period, it does bring such perspective to it. I mean, Jason, very quickly, that Oldham game, because you touched upon it there just briefly, the nature of it. I mean, God, incredible to think the permutations of what would have happened had the worst happened to Spurs. I mean, what do you remember, Jace, as a fan going into that Oldham game? I mean, Gareth just said there was a confidence in the dressing room, a positive mental attitude beforehand, with Sugar speaking to the players. Just how nervous was you going into that game? Now, that relegation was genuinely a very big possibility, Jace.
Oh, without a doubt, as a fan, I think you're always more nervous. You're looking at our current form. Like I said, we're on a run where we'd had a period of losing 7 straight games. I think we might have nicked a point. I forget who we nicked a point against, but you're going to Oldham, and I think I'm right in saying it might have been a Thursday game.
It was, yeah.
It was a Thursday night. And when you looked at the weather up at Oldham, talk about your traditional Pennines weather, absolutely downpouring and things, on a really heavy pitch. You're thinking, if we lose this game, our players will be mentally and physically shattered going into I think we had QPR on the last day of the season.
Yep.
So, if we lose tonight, I can't see how we then go and win at the weekend and get ourselves out of it. And that's how close it was. But you're right, we did actually play really well on the day. Scored a couple of goals at our end with Vinny and Housey, and actually deserved to win the game come the end of it. But it's the closest. Well, I mean, I saw Tottenham relegated in '76. This is the closest that it had been since then, and probably we've never got quite as close to it since, although got pretty close to it. But without a doubt, I remember going up to Oldham fearing the worst, that's for sure, because you just thought they're the home team. A win keeps them safe or puts them above us, and we're in doomsday, that's for sure, mate. But more drama. We save ourselves that summer. Like I say, the win at Oldham, and then I think did we get a win against QPR on the last day? I think we did. We might have ended up finishing the season 15th or something like that.
Yeah, we lost against QPR on the final day of the season.
Right, okay.
But yeah, we'd won a couple of games before Oldham, although we were still really in the mire going into that Oldham game. Yeah, it kind of goes a bit of an artificial boost. We'd beaten Southampton maybe a couple of weeks before, which was really crucial as well, because they were right down there with us, and I think they maybe got out on the last day of the season with Everton, who had that famous victory against Wimbledon, which kept them up as well. That's
right. I think we finished 15th, but it was never as comfortable as 15th would suggest it was. And then more drama that summer off the pitch. Yet another summer of drama. Tottenham are then charged themselves with making irregular payments to players. Colin Caldwell yet again involved, having been involved at Swindon before. And after a period where we have no idea, the media speculation is Tottenham could well be relegated anyway because of the off-the-field payments. The FA deliberated long and hard over a 2 or 3 week period, and then came up with a punishment that was a 12-point deduction, which would apply the following season, because had it applied to the one that's just gone, we had been relegated. As well as that, there would be a ban from the season's FA Cup. And as well as that, the club were fined a record fine at the time, which was something like £600,000. So that was the summer, the mood going into a summer where, as I say, when I think of some of the flack that goes on today with the running of Tottenham, how's that for your summer?
Yeah, that was pretty horrific. Yeah, there were contingencies in place for what the FA might do. Now, the backstory to this we probably already covered. So Terry Venables, who had left so acrimoniously the summer before, had subsequently been appointed as England manager in February '94, and there were court cases ongoing. There was the Panorama documentary on there as well, which was very heavily weighted on on Sugar's side, and probably factually quite rightly as well, but. There was a feeling that Sugar portrays in his book, which again I used as part of my research for this, that the FA and Graham Kelly in particular, who was sort of seen as this sort of hapless figurehead of the FA at the time, it perhaps suited their agenda to have a go at Spurs and to reduce the heat on Sugar, trying to put heat on Venables, really. So there was all this going on in the background, but Spurs had been found guilty of making irregular payments to players. So this was in Football League law, and this went back over a 10-year period. So this is before Alan Sugar's time at the club. I think it's very, very important just to point out that all the irregular payments, which essentially were payments made to players outside of their contractual terms. So a player would be, prospective player, they would offer money or give him a loan to buy a house or something else to help them move in. And now that was illegal. It happened before Sugar's time, and as part of all of everything that they uncovered in the aftermath of the Venables deal, Sugar and the people at Spurs had sort of become aware of this, and I think had several meetings with the FA about a number of things. And one of the things they said to them was, "Look, we found all this here. This is before we're in charge here. We want you to be aware of it." So they provided the evidence, from a position of honesty, I think, and they felt at the time, and I just had to remind myself of this, because these were things that happened when Spurs, it was pre-Premier League, so the Football League were in charge at the time. They felt that there was nothing that the Premier League, which was a new entity, and the FA, they couldn't intervene in that. But the FA decided they could, which was why the initial punishment came in place. And as you said, that felt like a really draconian punishment. I mean, definitely take 12 points off that team that finished the 93-94 season. You're going to go down the following year. So it was very uncertain times.
It was. Can I just say one thing, guys? Because we're an hour in, and I must just say, look, if you are really, really enjoying this chat, I would encourage you to go and buy the book. I mean, look, it's funny because we know when you try and relate it to nowadays, I mean, as I said at the opening of this show, God forbid there were podcasts around this time, what it would have been like week to week. I mean, we're not even talking about results here. We're talking about genuine concerns of relegation, fighting court battles. So I just want to give a reminder out there for those that are watching us live at the moment or watching this back on the replay back. You can buy this book directly via Amazon, which can be done for those watching this show on YouTube. You can go to the bottom left of your screen, or alternatively, you can go to Gareth's personal selling site over, of course, on the QR code at the top right, which can be bought for $17.50. That's obviously for I will just say this again, for our UK-based audience. That will work for you. For our overseas audience, you want to be using that Amazon QR code on the bottom left. But like I say, really fascinating stuff. And it doesn't stop there. The drama, the hysteria, it goes on. I will say again, we're joined by Jason McGovern. We're joined by the brilliant author of this book, Gareth Dace. It's a fascinating show we had here so far. And I've got to say, for me, although it's... Again, we're going back into a different time here. A bit of a welcome break, I will say, from the day-to-day operations of Spurs in the present era. Jace, amazingly, amongst all the doom and gloom as we entered that particular summer, we shocked the world. Not only the world, the Premier League, by the signing of what I think many would describe as a legend for the football club, a hero for those grown up in the 90s, of Jurgen Klinsmann. Possibly the last actual world-class player at the time of the signing we signed. And of course came his iconic celebration to mock the diving reputation he had rightly built up. Give me your memories, Jace. Take your mind back to the signing of Jurgen Klinsmann. And do you know what? I will ask you, if you can compare that for listeners of today, can you give a direct comparison of who would be the kind of relevant signing of how big that was at that time?
It's hard because, you know, he was the main striker for Germany that won a World Cup. But the diving thing was a big problem for sure in English. I think most of us were pretty fed up with the constant sight of German players in those days diving around, of which Jurgen was perhaps the most guilty one. So I was kind of strange. I thought, I don't really want to sign that bloke. That's all he ever does is dive. But there's no doubt he was a world-class player. He would become a massive figure for us just that one season that he was there. The game at Sheffield Wednesday, the opening day of the season, it was brilliant that he embraced all the problems that he'd had in England, and he just killed it with that famous diving celebration that's become an iconic thing, which all the players, I think, had encouraged him to do. But what a season he would go on to have. And, you know, when we talked about Gary Lineker being a world-class striker, and Gary Lineker was, without a doubt, scored just one goal from outside the box. Jurgen scored goals from all over the place that season. I mean, a fantastic bicycle kick early on against, I think it was against Everton.
Everton, yeah.
It might have been his first, it might have been his home debut, I think.
It was, yeah.
I think. It scored at Ipswich, where I think we followed up a 4-3 at Sheffield Wednesday with a 4-2 or something like that at Ipswich, beat an Everton side, scoring goals all over the place. A famous Aussie formation and things like that we'll come on to later. But Klinsmann definitely was probably, I think it's fair to say, you know, we've signed Gareth Bale, who was a world-class player, but he wasn't when we signed him. Mm-hmm. I think Jurgen's probably the last genuine world-class player that we actually signed when he was a world-class player. And what a season, and what an impression he would leave with the club.
Yeah, well, I think for context, it's about the world-class signing that Spurs made, but the Premier League or English football just didn't have those world-class players playing in there. All the best players in the world played in. So Italy was still dominant at the time. Spain and even France at the back end of the 80s. Of course, we lost Glenn Hoddle and Clive Allen went and played in France, didn't they? So the idea of this sort of world-class player coming to play in England at all was quite fanciful. And again, it just felt like it was part of just something that Spurs did. They signed these, they made these audacious transfers, and Klinsmann came in, and you said he had that reputation. And I know you spoke to Dean Austin, didn't you? I remember one of the lockdown shows, and Dean Austin will said the same as everyone else who was part of that squad. He absolutely charmed the pants off everyone because he was such a humble bloke. And there was no pretensions about him being this world-class star. He was just there to play his football. He wanted to enjoy life and see what London had to offer. He spoke nearly perfect English as well, which really helped. And he did so much, not just for Spurs, but for English football in the whole, because he really started that. It was his transfer that made clubs and chairmen around the country think, maybe this is what we need to do. Maybe we need to delve into these foreign markets and bring some of these foreign players over. And equally, it made foreign players look over at English football and think, well, if Klinsmann's gone there, then I want a piece of it as well.
And the impact that signing made could be seen even in pre-season, where I think we went over to Ireland for a pre-season game and it was sold out. We went to Watford. It was thousands at Watford trying to get a glimpse of Klinsmann. He was a massive superstar without a doubt. And of course, he had a brilliant season. I think he scored 29 goals that season. But as things at Tottenham, it was all too short-lived. And as the season came to an end, we found out he was on his way back to Bayern Munich. And it was kind of over before we really had a chance to really understand it all.
Yeah, no, definitely. So he talked about how he was quite happy. He had this 2-year deal with Spurs. So he'd signed on Alan Sugar's yacht in Monte Carlo. He joined the club. He signed a 2-year contract. But he said whilst he was very happy, he had a phone call at his house one morning from Franz Beckenbauer, who is the Kaiser. He's the number one personality in probably German football history. He was president of Bayern Munich, and Beckenbauer called him up and said, "Look, we want you to be our centre forward next season." And unfortunately, we couldn't compete with that. When Bayern Munich come calling, if you're the German international centre forward, you probably go there despite where you are. So unfortunately, and again in acrimonious circumstances with our chairman, he left the club in summer 1995.
Tottenham strikers still go to Bayern Munich nowadays.
It's known, isn't it?
and I mean, that season was an astonishing season where not just Jurgen had come. We'd had the '94 World Cup in America, where Romania, I think, had gone to the semi-finals. We signed Ili Dimitrescu that had wowed people at that World Cup. We had a front five, really, of Anderton, Sheringham, Dimitrescu, Jurgen. Was Barnby there then still?
Barnby, yeah, they were the five.
This member. And Ozzy came up with his formation, 4-1-5 formation. No holding midfield player. Don't worry about midfield. I think Colin Calderwood or something was the midfield player. And when I said, what happens when we haven't got the ball? And Ozzy's view was, we've got so many talented players, we will have the ball. And that was it. And 4-1-5 was goals at both ends of the pitch. Crazy football. But it soon came to a head when we went to Notts County for a League Cup game. Notts County were bottom of the Championship. They sacked their manager and we somehow lost 3-0 in a League Cup game. And I think you had a pretty raw experience because you was at another game that night. Was it at Bradford or somewhere like that?
Well, I was. Well, what my story is, and I need to give you the background to this. My cousin is Gary Lewin, who was the Arsenal physio and England physio for a long time. Wow. And so my family on that side, the Lewins, are sort of Arsenal people. So every October during half term, we as a family, mum, dad and sister, we'd normally go up to the northwest because dad had a couple of business interests up there. And fortunately, a couple of years before that, I said I'd gone to that League Cup game when we won at Man City in '93. Well, we happened to be in Manchester then. So It comes around to the following year, October '94. Oh, what football's up in October during half term? Oh, United and City are both away. Oh, Oldham, they're at home. Oh, they're playing Arsenal. Well, let's speak to Gary and see if he'll get us a couple of tickets. So me and my dad have gone to Boundary Park to watch Oldham, famous venue where we famously survived Spurs. Not long ago we've spoken about that, and so we've got these 2 tickets at the back of the Arsenal end at Oldham. And fortunately, it was a terrible game, as all Arsenal games at the point, whether they won or not, it was a terrible game. It was a 0-0 game there. But the only thing that excited the Arsenal fans, who I was sat amongst, was someone listening on his radio who shouted out midway through the first half, "Tottenham are losing!" And that was the biggest cheer that came from their crowd. And then the Oldham PA announcer got in on it as well and was egging them on and saving that score till the end and talking about Dumitrescu getting sent off. So if there was a worse place to be than Notts County that evening, I found it.
It's fascinating. I mean, Jace, do you know what? I'm just thinking of what I would have been like doing a review of Spurs.
You couldn't tolerate losing on penalties to Fulham, a Premier League team, and here we are getting dumped by bottom of the Championship, managerless Notts County 3-0.
I mean,
I'm up at Notts County watching it. I mean, that's how bad it is.
Was it just the case, Jason? The iconic games in that season, they came in the FA Cup, right? Didn't they?
They did. 2 actually that season. There's the famous Ronnie Rosenthal hat-trick game at Southampton where we're 2-0 down and lucky not to be about 4 or 5-0 down. And then Ronnie Rosenthal comes on and totally changes the tie with this astonishing hat-trick. And we win that game 6-2. An incredible game of football. And that took us up to Anfield. And, our record at Anfield is another one. I mean, even Bill Nicholson's teams couldn't win at Anfield. We've gone like 72 years or something before Garth Crooks got us a winner in the mid-80s. And we'd won, I think Clive Allen might have got a winning goal there. And we won a couple of times at Anfield, but it still wasn't a great place to go for us. But it was my birthday, March the 11th, FA Cup quarter-final. We got a goal down. I think Robbie Fowler might have scored it, but to come back and win with I think Jurgen might have got the equaliser. I think
Teddy got the equaliser.
Aaron got the equaliser, and Jurgen got the winner.
That's in front of the Kop, yeah.
Teddy got a brilliant bending effort, and Jurgen got the winner at the Kop ends late on in the game, if I remember rightly, quite late in the game. But yeah. I mean, I'd grown up. This is why I despise Liverpool more than Chelsea. My first ever visit to Anfield was the 7-0 in the 78. I was a kid that cried. My mum was a Liverpool fan, came home, took the mickey out of me, probably only said one thing, but it felt like she was bullying me, cried my eyes out again, hated Liverpool from that moment onwards. They were the glamour team of the 80s, winning so many things. So to me, I think to go to Anfield and win on my birthday, to be able to come home and say to mum, what a day that is. That was a game that meant a lot to me, beating Liverpool, and it still does. Beating Liverpool means more to me than beating Chelsea nowadays. That hatred of them as state, and living in Thailand where half the country's Liverpool potty and it's rammed down your throat every day. So, yeah, that was an iconic game and 2 iconic goals. Teddy's goal, as I say, when you look at it, with a brilliant bender that just drifts off the post. But was a fantastic win, and Jerry Francis has actually took over that from Ozzy, and actually had got us looking quite solid, and had kept us playing quite decent football actually. Yeah. Then of course played Everton in that semi-final, and we've had David Howes on here, we've had Darren Anderson on here, we've had Dean Austin on here, and they all talk about that semi-final perhaps being their worst ever memory at Ellen Road, where we got half the ground. 18,000 tickets each, but ours was all in one stand on the side, and Everton had 3 sides, including behind 2 goals, and it just felt like an away game from the moment it kicked off. I think the players said they came out the tunnel and it just never felt like a neutral venue, and we lost to an Everton team that was horrible. I think they were called the Dogs of War, weren't they? That was the thing to them. I mean, they were a horrible, snarling, kick it, if it moved, kick it type of team. Andy Hinchcliffe, ironically, who tells everybody what they should do on Sky nowadays, was famous for taking corners that would be right under your crossbar, and it'd be a massive bundle, and actually Sean Dyche type bundles under the crossbar, but they were a horrible team. Barry Horn and people like that playing. And I think Amakachi, who scored from Nigerian player, and we lost an FA Cup semi-final 4-1. When again, that's a missed opportunity, because we were a miles better football team than Everton, but they end up winning it 4-1.
Yeah, they did. I mean, I won't go into. I'll let people buy the book to get the detail in it. But of course, having been banned from the FA Cup at the start of the season and had the points deducted, those have been overturned. So we went into the FA Cup there, and there was a real feeling that our name was on the cup that year. And particularly after those sort of iconic wins at Southampton, and at Liverpool, and Jerry Francis I spoke to in the book as well, and he was really concerned about the state of hubris around the club, not so much within the playing squad, but he was really concerned him. This talk about the name being on the cup, and all we had to do was turn up and beat Everton, because he knew that they were not necessarily a technically good team, but they were a very efficient team. They'd had a good run at the back end of that season. They'd given us a really tough game in December up at Goodison that year. So he was really nervous going into it, and everything went against us on the day that we didn't have a left back available to us. I think Dean Austin told you that story, didn't he? I think he said he felt that he probably should have volunteered and played at left back, and Stuart Nethercott played on his natural side on the right. But at the end, Stuart Nethercott, a central defender, and very much a central defender, played out on the left, which unbalanced us. I think Popescu was injured. Anderton wasn't right.
Played.
Yeah, that's it. Campbell was out injured. Edinburgh, I think, was suspended. So the balance of the team was never quite right that day. And you said, the Everton having three sides of the ground just seemed to unsettle us. And we talked about, those days where it's going to go for you, and something about the Everton game. Not long into it, you realised it wasn't. And one fantastic bit of trivia that I picked up was that this was the day after the Grand National, and you said Everton were managed by Joe Royle. Well, the Grand National was run by a 40-1 outsider called Royal Athlete just 24 hours before that game. So the writing was on the wall, wasn't it?
Crazy, absolutely crazy. Look, I think we've touched upon, Jason. Give me 60 seconds, just very quickly, Jason, how much it did hurt that Klinsmann just stayed for that one season. When you talk about that Liverpool game for you, and what it meant to you on your birthday as well, the special nature of that game, Jurgen playing a huge part. 60 seconds, what did it mean to you, Jace, with him departing the club?
He'd become an iconic player in no time at all. Did he win the PFA Player of the Year that season or something like that? I can't remember, but he'd certainly won maybe the Football Writers Player of the Year or something like that. And it just the quality of goals, the partnership between him and Teddy was so good. And it did hurt, and it perhaps culminated over the summer with one of the most unedifying moments I think I've ever had as a Spurs fan, where Alan Sugar went on, I think it was Midweek Sports Special or Sports Week or whatever it was, to discuss it, because he definitely felt let down by Jurgen leaving so quickly. And he had a Jurgen Klinsmann shirt on national TV that Klinsmann had given to him, and screwed it up and threw it at the TV camera and said, "It's not even fit to wash your car with." And I just thought, that was that to me summed up what Alan Sugar was as a chairman. And it's something that stuck in me. And to this day, I've never been able to watch anything with Alan Sugar in it, from still haunted by that. I've never watched The Apprentice, which of course Lee famously was the winner of. And when people say go back and watch it, I've had nothing to do with Sugar ever since that day, mate. And like I say, what an unedifying sight that is, to have your chairman throwing a player's shirt on TV saying it's not even fit to wash your car with. The irony being that 18 months later he had to go and sign Klinsmann to save us from another relegation.
I mean, what comes next, coming over to you, Gareth, is, again, if this happened in the modern era, I don't know what we would do. I mean, look, again, we obviously have got a situation around, obviously, Harry departing the club again, the club's greatest ever striker, but amazingly, we replaced Jurgen Klinsmann with Chris Armstrong. Is that one of our biggest ever downgrades, Gareth?
I mean, if it is, that's because of how good Klinsmann was, not necessarily because of Armstrong. In fairness to him, so yeah, Chris Armstrong was signed for us, and it felt so underwhelming. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we were largely touted as being about to sign Dennis Bergkamp. So Klinsmann, having sort of almost started this revolution of foreign players coming over to England, carried on the following year. And I spoke to Jerry Francis about this in sort of quite some detail, and in his mind, the Bergkamp deal we signed Klinsmann for £2 million. By the way, I think it's just worth putting in that context. That's how much it cost to sign Jurgen Klinsmann. Bergkamp, the fee that was quoted was over £10 million. So he said straight away he was going to be, and that was before the wages came into it. So there was no way that Spurs were ever going to sign Dennis Bergkamp. And Jerry Francis told me, and there's a real authenticity about this. He said, well, look, Dennis Bergkamp is famous for being a number 10. He's playing off the front man. And who was the remaining striker that I had at Spurs at the time? I had Teddy Sheringham. So you tell me to put Sheringham and Bergkamp in the same team. He said, I'm not sure that they were compatible. Well, I wanted a number 9 like Klinsmann, but of course, I'm not going to be able to sign another Klinsmann because there is no other Jurgen Klinsmann apart from Jurgen Klinsmann out there. So his first choice was Les Ferdinand, who was going to leave QPR that summer, who Jerry had worked with at QPR. But again, his price tag was considered to be too much, and he signed for Newcastle, who was splashing cash at the time, like it was going out of business, and they spent £6 million on him. So Chris Armstrong fitted the profile, and of course, nowadays it would probably be easier to sell to fans because you say, well, look, we've got all this data. It tells us the runs that he makes and the pace that he's got, and how he combines with different players and closing players down, and all the other stats that are out there. So I think from a numbers perspective, you could see the sense in Armstrong, but it felt really underwhelming that we'd lost Klinsmann and that Bergkamp, who was sort of the next big thing, the next big taxi off the rank, of course, goes down the road to Arsenal. So summer 95 was a very, very unsettling one. And of course, not only did we lose Klinsmann, but Dumitrescu had been bombed out fairly early on. He just didn't work with Jerry Francis at all. And then Popescu, who'd been signed as well, this World Cup player from Romania, he had left at the first opportunity, and probably he was only ever using Spurs in the Premier League as a stepping stone to go to Barcelona, where he did. So I guess I've got some sympathy for Alan Sugar at that point for thinking foreign players are mercenaries. I mean, I don't agree with him, but I can understand where he was coming from at the time. I'm not going to sign any of them. And Jerry Francis was happy to sign Chris Armstrong. So that was the reason why Armstrong ended up at Spurs. And Jason, I know will come in a moment, but actually all of the numbers about Chris Armstrong's first season and his partnership with Teddy were very, very good. They absolutely match Sheringham and Klinsmann's goal ratios to Sheringham and Armstrong's. Look, I am never with a straight face going to say that Chris Armstrong is anywhere near the same platform as Jurgen Klinsmann. But yeah, I think he's much maligned as a Spurs player, Chris Armstrong. But I mean, I'm suffering from Stockholm syndrome having written this book. But Chris Armstrong is a player that I would like to be remembered far more fondly than perhaps people will remember him as.
Jace, please do come in.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think Alan was stung by Klinsmann's dismissal, or departure rather than dismissal, and the fact that the other foreigners, the Romanians, didn't work out. And he gave an interview to the Sun newspaper, and I'm going to read the quote out, which kind of, just bear in mind what Dennis Bergkamp was to become. Arsenal have taken on an almighty risk. There's no way that Bergkamp is going to make the same impact as Klinsmann. Arsenal have got him because they needed a bit of cosmetic marketing. Sugar went on to say, I don't think Tottenham could ever sign a superstar like a Klinsmann or a Bergkamp again. And he described foreign players as Carlos Kickerballs, who would go anywhere, play for anyone, whoever pays them the most money. And I think Thierry Henry recently said Dennis Bergkamp's the greatest player he's ever played with, and he's played with Messi. So and Dennis Bergkamp was the catalyst for everything Arsenal became. And as I say, that's one Carlos Kickerball that certainly worked out, didn't it? And I said to Gareth, those views that Sugar then held saw us actually, when we did sign foreign players, they had to be cheap. So that summer, we signed Stefan Everson, Alan Nielsen and Ramon Vega. Arsenal signed the likes of Patrick Vieira and Nicolas Anelka. Chelsea signed Vialli, Gianfranco Zola, Frank Leboeuf, Di Matteo. And if ever there was a summer that showed you just how far Tottenham were falling behind those two London clubs, that's the summer, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's the point, isn't it? Where it all goes wrong. And I use the metaphor in the book. I said it would have been like Christopher Columbus having discovered the New World, coming back and decided he was only going to sail around the Isle of Wight afterwards. It was a sliding doors moment for us, certainly that summer and that middle part of the 90s, when other clubs and our nearest and dearest investing in players, and you think, Middlesbrough even managed to get Juninho, Emerson and Ravanelli over. Newcastle was signing the likes of Philippe Albert and Ginola, of course, we've become familiar with a little bit later on. So we really missed the boat, sadly.
I'm going to ask you again, Gareth, just a reminder, let me know when I'm bringing in the teletext.
Yep. Yeah, it's the following summer.
Okay, interesting. Because again, I mean, you think we're around this time, it's absolutely crazy. Jason, I'll let you come back in here.
So, like I say, they're the quality of players being signed by our nearest and dearest rivals, and that season that then becomes the 97-98 season. Arsenal win a double, Chelsea win the other two trophies, and Tottenham couldn't do a double over Barnsley. That sums up the position of the three clubs. We played Barnsley, couldn't beat them, whilst those two are both winning two trophies. Teddy was sold to Man United. Emmanuel Petit was set to sign for Tottenham, paid for his taxi fare. He stopped off at Arsenal on the way, signs for Arsenal. Jerry Francis left by mutual consent during the season. Christian Gross was appointed as manager, was dead man walking with his tube ticket from the moment. And even Alan Sugar apparently said from the moment that Christian Gross held his train ticket aloft in the press conference, Alan Sugar knew that he was gone. And if we were ever supposed to get a new manager bounce, Christian Gross actually won his first game at Everton, but then we lost 6-1 at home to Chelsea in his home debut, followed by a 4-0 defeat at Coventry. And as we came yet another relegation scrap season. What a summer. What a season. Bring me Twitter in those days, please.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Well, it's not if all those things did happen. I mean, just to give the chronology, the year after Klinsmann left, the 95-96 season, when we were within 2 points of finishing fifth and getting in the UEFA Cup with that Sheringham and Armstrong team. But you're right, it very much fell apart after that, and all of those things sadly happened. And that is, the book title, the subtitle of it, The Magic, Mayhem and Mediocrity. I mean, that period from, I guess, 96 through to 98 is where the mediocrity really sets in, unfortunately. And despite Jerry's best efforts, he couldn't turn that round. As you said, Teddy, who was by then our talisman, left the club as well, seeking new challenges and playing at the level that he deserved to play at. And of course, he went to Man United, and there we are back in sort of winter '97, stuck in the relegation zone with a bloke brandishing a tube ticket in his press conference as our new manager. And there he is. And again, one of those things where you could kind of see the sense in the appointment of a foreigner, because 12 months before that, Arsenal had appointed this unknown French bloke called Arsène Wenger that's generated the newspaper headlines Arsène Who. And of course, he went in and not only transformed Arsenal, sadly, but he transformed English football in the way that players were conditioned, diets, nutritions. He tapped into foreign markets to sign players who were technically far better than what we would get over here at a fraction of the price as well. So you can see why Alan Sugar would think, well, if they found him, I'm going to go and find the next best one. And Christian Gross was a largely unheard of bloke who'd won a Swiss league title at the time, and he'd been recommended to him, and there he turns up in North London.
And Gareth, to stick with you, after all the acrimony of Jurgen's departure, we turned to him yet again to dig us out of a huge hole we were in. And I have to tell you, I mean, I do remember how big this game was. It was drilled into me that Wimbledon game was really, although it wasn't a game if Spurs lost, it would have gone down. You felt at the time it was a really pivotal game in the course of where the season was going, that Spurs had to genuinely go to Wimbledon and get a result, and get a result they did. How big would you say that result was in the 90s period for Tottenham? If you could kind of, as a whole.
I mean, we spoke about the 93-94 season, and Jason, you said that you thought that was the closest we ever came to relegation. I think that's good. It was a really, really poor team. We were never actually in the relegation zone. We were always just hovering above it. But 97-98, I think we dropped down to 19th not long after that debacle against Chelsea and Coventry, and we rarely got out of the bottom three until this 4 games towards the end of the season when we travelled to Wimbledon, Selhurst. It was like a home game, probably the exact opposite of that experience of playing against Everton in the semi-final. Yeah. So whenever we went to Wimbledon, we took a huge crowd with us, and we probably had 3/4 of the ground, despite the fact it was an away game for us. The sun was glorious that day. It was a beautiful spring day. And
just say, part of that, for anyone that doesn't remember the time, or for overseas listeners, Wimbledon had to move to Selhurst Park, to Crystal Palace's stadium, because Plough Lane was being demolished. So, and Wimbledon had a fan base, bit like, well, they were smaller. Plough Lane had been a smaller ground than Luton or Bournemouth is in the Premier League. It used to be about 7,000-8,000. So that was pretty much Wimbledon's fan base, 10,000 people. And suddenly they're playing at Selhurst Park that could hold, 25, 26. So, there was far more Spurs. You're right, far more Spurs. And the away fans used to get what's the Holmesdale end. So we were in the home end, and this tiny little bit behind the goal was what Wimbledon were left with.
Mm-hmm. That's it. And I guess a bit like that Oldham game, it was just an afternoon where everything clicked for us. But we had Klinsmann, who was the star of the show, so he scored 4 goals. We had Ginola, who we'd signed the previous summer, and he was certainly before Klinsmann re-signed for us midway through that season. Ginola had started to establish himself as this mercurial talent who, again, very much fitted into everything that Spurs were all about. And he turned up on the day as well. I think Ben Thatcher tried to literally kick him off the pitch and was sent off at some point in the second half. So we were playing against 10 men, and the goals flowed. So Klinsmann scored 4. Les Ferdinand, who was now a Spurs player, scored another one for us, and Moussa Saib. Another one of those sort of cult names from the 90s popped up for us that day. But yeah, that was really, really precarious, as I say, because for much of that season we were actually in the bottom 3.
And then we do survive that season. So here we are going into the 99 season, I think now. Christian Gross was sacked early that season, which wasn't a surprise really, because he wasn't particularly popular amongst the players either. But Alan Sugar turned to George Graham as the man. And the irony of that is not only was it a man steeped in Arsenal's traditions, if you think about the decade starting where Alan Sugar had sacked Terry Venables for what became financial irregularities, George Graham was the only man at the time who'd been found guilty by the FA of financial irregularities. So we'd sacked a Tottenham legend for doing exactly what we've now hired an Arsenal legend for the same things. And, that to me was another unforgivable thing that we did, that we turned to this Arsenal iconic man whose football was all about boring 1-0 wins. We all knew that David Ginola's time was going to be a problem, and it was yet another bizarre decision by Alan Sugar.
Yeah.
Go for it, Gareth. I was going to say, before Gareth comes in there, Jace, so I want to ask you the question. Ultimately, that appointment led to you making a big decision over Spurs, right, Jace?
It was. I mean, the fans never took to George Graham. Would talk about what he did, but there was the famous song "Man in the Raincoat's Blue and White Army." We just refused to sing his name. It was never going to be a popular decision, and I can honestly say, from the moment George Graham took the club, I said I will never go back to White Hart Lane, and I never saw a single game at White Hart Lane under George Graham's reign. It was the breaking point for me. I think the first time I went back was under Glenn when we beat Derby. Gus Poyet scored beat Derby 3-0 or 3-1. Gus Poyet scored a fantastic lob, but I genuinely refused to have anything to do financially with giving money to Tottenham Hotspur. I would still see the odd away game in that time, but I had no intentions of going to White Hart Lane ever to watch a George Graham side. And when, Mourinho got close to me, thinking I can't sit through a Mourinho season. But, George Graham won us a trophy. But I'll never look back on that time with much affection for winning a trophy. We absolutely stunk Wembley out to win that trophy. It was a horrendous trophy. I just should never have been Tottenham's manager. And when people talk about the glory of trophies, that's a trophy that, I'd have quite happily gone without if it meant George Graham winning it, that's for sure.
Can I ask you, Gareth, I have to ask you, ultimately, was that appointment justified when Graham led us to the League Cup?
Do you know, it was a really difficult one. I mean, a lot of people felt like Jason, and I can remember I found it as part of my research. There was a clip on YouTube, and it was, I don't know, an ITV evening news slot, and there was a load of Spurs fans out the gateway because we all knew it was going to happen. It was football's worst kept secret that he was going to leave Leeds and come back south and manage Spurs. And
we played Leeds at the time, didn't we? When it was going on, we had a 3-3 draw at White Hart Lane against Leeds, didn't we?
He was the manager, yeah. When everyone knew it was going to happen, and in fact, that was the document or the footage I saw. It was before that game. There was both Spurs and Leeds fans talking about it and speculating about what it might mean.
Was that the last game at Leeds?
It was his last league game. They played a UEFA Cup game, I think, in Portugal on the Wednesday night, and then he came back and resigned the following morning. And
so he played at Leeds, and then he becomes our manager for the next Premier League game.
It was an away game at Derby, yeah. But it really split the fan base because for the purists and the romantics, like Jason, George Graham was the absolute antithesis of everything that Spurs were all about. But on the other hand, there was, I think, because Arsenal they'd won the double the year before that, there was a real desperation at the point that we needed to win something. We needed to try and catch up with Arsenal.
Where have we heard this before?
Oh, well, yeah, there you go. And whilst, Alex Ferguson was obviously considered to be the best manager about at the time, and he was en route to securing the treble for United. But if you wanted a guarantee of winning things, then George Graham was your go-to man. And the fact that he was willing to leave Leeds and come down, and there was always this talk that he had unfinished business at Arsenal, or at least he wanted to prove a point to them because he felt that they had very unjustly got rid of him for the financial irregularities that had happened. So actually, if you listen to those Spurs fans who were spoken to outside, there are people who have very strong opinions, as Jason had, and equally there are others of them who are saying, well, I don't really like it, but he's going to win things for us because that's what he did. And from a personal perspective, I said, because of my family ties to Gary Lewin, who worked with George Graham, he absolutely loved George Graham as a manager, and kind of tactic or take the football tactics and the style of play out of way. The way that he told me that the way that he'd built that sort of collective spirit around the team and around the place. You sort of felt that, he would achieve things. And I think in the early days, and again, you were obviously completely switched off to this, Jason, but in the early days, I'm not going to say that these were great games or games that people will remember, but we did have some really good moments. There was the League Cup tie when we beat Man United. So the only reason Man United didn't win the quadruple in that season is because we beat them in the quarterfinal of the League Cup. And that was a fantastic night under the lights at White Hart Lane, first week of December. Ginola, one of his best performances, two assists and a goal he scored. Yeah, you remember it from the edge of the D. So there was a period where, although you always knew in your back of your mind, this isn't going to work, or at least Ginola's never going to be part of this team. There was a point because Ginola won both the Players' Player of the Year and the football rights.
Say, Gareth, it broke my heart. Ginola was my favourite player growing up, and I will say it absolutely broke my heart. I don't forget my dad coming home telling me, Rick, I'm really sorry to tell you, Ginola's leaving the club. It honestly, at the time, I mean, again, I'm a young kid growing up. I had him on the back of my shirt, and he represented everything Spurs was for me growing up. That flair, that unbelievable ability to score unbelievable goals at any point. And that was what, for me, drew me to Spurs. Maybe not the nature of results week to week, but players like him. Today is why I'm a Spurs fan, for those unbelievable players. And again, for those that, follow the club now for all different reasons. Do you know, I reckon around my era, this kind of era from the 90s was a huge reason why many Spurs fans absolutely loved watching David Ginola. And you know what? Although maybe you could argue he was coming towards the end of his period in terms of how good he was as a player, he was still an unbelievable player. And again, you look at the fact that when he went to Villa, and he showed George Graham the celebration, of course, with the. I think we can all remember that. It's just one unbelievable player, incredible player, David Ginola.
Yeah, well, I mean that season there's 3 goals. So there's the one he scored against Barnsley in the FA Cup, which is Ricky Villa-esque when he slalomed in. There was the goal he scored against Leeds in the Cup replay. So you'll never see 2 better Spurs goals in the same game. So Darren Anderton rocketed one in from about 30 yards, and then Ginola scored one, and then he very, very nearly scored another one in that same game. Do you remember he dribbled? He carried the ball almost from the right touchline, and he was just beating players for fun running, and he was teasing everyone. And he hit this shot when you thought the angle was against him, having taken it across the other side of the penalty box, that hit one post, went across the line, and the camera focused in on George Graham, and he thought it had gone in, and Chris Hughton had to tell him it hadn't. And maybe that was the one moment when you thought that if there's going to be any synergy between George Graham and Spurs, that probably was the moment there and then. But of course, we won the League Cup. You said we stunk the place out. In fairness, Leicester under Martin O'Neill played their part as well in that game, being an absolute
Robbie Savage
game. Yeah,
Robbie Savage being Robbie Savage. Yeah, awful game.
It was a dreadful game. The best thing about Alan Nielsen scoring in stoppage time was that it denied us all another 30 minutes of it.
That's very, very true. Very, very true.
But I was there, and look, so within his first season, the league form sort of plateau, we drew a hell of a lot of games that year, usually 0-0 against teams like Derby or Coventry. But the cup runs were really exciting, and we probably should have got to the FA Cup final that year as well. We played Newcastle in the semi-final at Old Trafford, having already won the League Cup, and we were absolutely sawn off because Dabby's ass handled a ball, didn't he, about 8 feet up in the air, and how Paul Durkin, the referee, didn't spot that. And I'm sure if we'd have got 1-0 up in that game, we probably would have held on to it.
Is it only Spurs that get these, before VAR, before the invention of VAR, when you think about the Pedro Mendes, the goals with Gomez and with Bale, just on another one there, you think about moments there that if VAR was in the game, how different it would be. Jace, I'm not going to bother and ask you if that softened your trophy stance. You've made that very, very clear already. But what I will ask you, Jace, is that there was a dramatic end to that season, wasn't there, on the last day as we travelled to Old Trafford, where, similar to the weekend just gone by, really, in terms of split loyalties about what you wanted for a result, Jace.
Yeah, genuinely, and like I said, I went to a few away games in that period, and Old Trafford was one that I was at. When everyone talks about the nightmare scenario of Arsenal winning the league or Manchester City coming to Tottenham in the last week of the season, this is match day 38, last day of the season. Arsenal are 1 point behind Man United. We're playing Man United on the last day of the season. We get a point there, or we beat Man United. Arsenal win the league because of Tottenham winning at Old Trafford. That's ridiculous. And Les Ferdinand scored what must be the coldest goal that Tottenham have ever scored by putting us 1-0 up. And there was a few cheers from the home supporter, from the Spurs end, but most of us thinking, what the hell are you doing? You clown, why haven't you put it into Rosehead? It's the numbest feeling I have ever had when Tottenham have scored to take a lead in a game. There's not one bit of me wanted to jump up with joy. You're just thinking, no, not of all days. Don't come to Old Trafford today and go and beat them. But as it turned out, Man United turned the game round. I think Beckham might have scored a cracking goal in the top corner. Maybe Andy Cole got one that day or something as well. And Man United win the game 3-1 and thankfully win the league by Tottenham losing there on the last day. But no, if last day scenarios, that's got to be one of the worst ones of the lot.
Yeah,
and it's the only time I've wanted Tottenham to ever lose a game.
Crazy, isn't it? Crazy.
And again, by contrast, Arsenal, it was the point when all the games were played at the same time. It was one of the first years that had happened. But meanwhile, at Highbury, Arsenal were playing Villa, ironically, talking about what's happened last weekend. And you could see the camera panned in, didn't they? When news came through on transistor radios, this was before iPhones, that Spurs had gone 1-0 up. You see all these Arsenal fans celebrating the fact that Tottenham have scored. So it was it was a really bizarre afternoon.
That decade, Gareth, ended with early cup exits, particularly painful in Kaiserslautern, more mid-table mediocrity, the gulf in North London ever widening, and a club that definitely had regressed over the decade, and yet more success trophy-wise than we've had in 24 years since. How do you sum up that particular period for you?
It's the decade that transformed football. It's the decade that transformed me as a human being, seeing the world through the prism of football and Tottenham Hotspur. And I guess it's very much shaped me. It's shaped the club, and and the decade has shaped football, English football in particular, ever since then. So, I guess I'm really pleased with the subtitle of the book, Magic, Mayhem and Mediocrity, because
Brilliant.
I think when I first started writing the book, it was very much on the basis of that the 90s were an awful period, and we should be grateful for what we've got now. But actually, there were equal measures of magic, mayhem and mediocrity. You think about the sort of the pantheon of Spurs greats in Gascoigne, Klinsmann and Ginola, who spread quite evenly across the decade, and you've got all this chaos that's going on the pitch and on the side of the pitch and off the pitch as well. But so I guess sadly, to use one of the lines from the book, it's a decade that began with a signing Gary Lineker from Barcelona and ended with a signing Dave McEwen from Dulwich Hamlet, and that probably goes a long way to tell you how Spurs fell in prominence as the 90s progressed.
And can I just say, one of the highlights of the 90s, many will know, is the fact that obviously there was teletext, CFAX for some, and we've got a really interesting snippet here for those that are watching this show on YouTube as opposed to audio, which I'll just give a mention to. So there's an image here of a very, very, I don't want to age you, Gareth, a very young looking Gareth here, taken last week, of course, no doubt about it, with obviously the very famous teletext where this is, I believe, you'll correct me, Gareth, what year have you wrote this message?
Right, so this is 1997. So, I did check this. The 23rd of June, you can see on the screen there as well. So this was in the middle of my GCSE period. So the fact I was spending more time writing letters to teletext than concentrating on my GCSE results explains why my GCSE results were probably as mediocre as Spurs were at the time. But this is summer 1997. So I'm 16 years old, and you could write your letters in, and if they thought they were any good or it was a particularly there's 20 of them by the looks of it, by the page numbers on there, but yeah, my letter made it, and that's me demanding that Spurs up the ante a little bit and start signing top quality players in there. Look, some of them stand the test of time on there. There's perhaps one which is a bit iffy, but
who's Hopkin?
So David Hopkin had scored. It's a bit of recency bias there. He had just that summer scored the winner for Palace in the playoff final against Sheffield United. It was a really good goal. So he was I guess a semi-creative central midfield player there, but certainly not fit to lace Matthew Le Tissier or Denilson's boots, who were mentioned in the. I've just realised I spelled Denilson's name wrong as well, so sorry about that.
I knew you meant there. But can you just hold it up, Rick? There's two bits of it. The opening and the closing lines are just brilliant, aren't they?
Yeah.
When you think of every summer transfer window and the chaos that goes on, and yet there's this thing that another day goes by and still no new signings at Tottenham, and we're on the 23rd of June then. So that relates to today. But the funny thing is that Gareth says we're going to end up as the next Manchester City. Oh, Gareth, can we turn into the next Manchester City, please?
It's fascinating.
It just shows what Manchester City were in those days.
Well, they'd just been relegated to the third division.
Yeah,
that was the reference point there. They'd had back-to-back relegations, having never been any more than a lower mid-table team in the top flight anyway.
And there we are mocking Manchester City, and we don't want to become them. Our football has changed.
It's crazy. I mean, Jace, this period that we've reviewed here, is it fair to say that despite the two trophies that Spurs won in that era, you've discussed them both on the show, you don't look back at that decade with much joy? Is it fair to say that, Jace?
Without a doubt, going into the decade, like I say, we got Gazers and Linekers. We look like we're going places as a club, third in the table. We win an FA Cup. There's all that excitement of what we're becoming, having done Arsenal in a semi-final. And the decade ends with us, having occupied more on the back pages, becoming further and further away from being a contending football club. Yes, we've just won a trophy, but my love of Tottenham has reached a stage where I don't even want to go to the club. It's not so much my love of Tottenham, the state the club is in. I've got no interest in even going to Tottenham. So, from being a season ticket holder going into it to not wanting to go to Tottenham shows you how far that decade did for me. And like I say, whatever people want to talk about today's rung of a football club. There will never be a chairman that runs a club like Alan Sugar did for me. And he stripped everything that Tottenham stood for as a football club away. And I think, regardless of what people think, that era set Tottenham back so far. It's untrue. And I think it's been hard for us ever to become the club that we were going at the start of that era ever since, because other clubs came and took over our places. And you can't just run roughshod over several other elite football clubs now. I mean, we were a member of the Big Five going into that. And when we talk about that as a Big Five, we're not talking about it being like the top six today. Those 5 clubs were the powerhouses, and we're not an elite football club anymore, and we were an elite football club at the start of that decade.
Yeah, it's honestly just quite incredible. And I can just say we've recorded nearly over 2 hours here. And I just want to say, for those that are hearing this, I don't think we've only touched even still a lot of the surface of a lot that goes into this book. So I want to urge everybody out there that, again, when you're looking at the period Spurs are going through yet another transitional season at the moment, if you think this period has got bumps in the road, please, I urge you, go and buy this book. And for all the therapy you've been given a last word on Spurs, the therapy of the 90s will...
I need therapy on a weekly basis.
All I can just say is, I thank my dad that I was not born into that generation in this one, because I don't think we would have survived doing podcasts back then. It's a fascinating book. I'm going to close it in a second by reading the forward part that I want to mention about Julie Welsh, an unbelievable part. But Gareth, it's only what I hand it back to you to close this show, because the book covers each season with contributions from the likes of David Howes, Jerry Francis, amongst many others, as we mentioned, Julie Welsh, Paul Hawksby, many other well-known contributors, and a season-by-season appendix of results and the climate of football in that particular season. And also, you mentioned something to us very, very interesting off-air in the green room about just the amount of players that are mentioned in this book. So I want to hand it to you so you can take the stage here for that part.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so there were 109 players who made a first-team appearance for Spurs in the period. So from the 1st of August 1989 through to the end of May 2000, including 8 of them who played in the Intertoto Cup. Read up on the Intertoto Cup; that's probably a book in itself. And each one of those players,
Euro checker trade.
Absolutely, yeah. Look it up on Wikipedia. Intertoto Cup. Each one of those 109 players are name checked at least once within the book. And I mean, that was partly because I got to a point where I'd written the whole manuscript and thought, actually, let me see how many players I had mentioned and how many played. About the time that the club released these legacy numbers. So it was quite good timing, actually, to be able to go and cross-reference. And I'd mentioned all by about 8 of them. So you will notice when you read the script, my desperate attempts to shoehorn Peter Garland and Mark Robson's name into certain pages of the book. But every single player who has made a contribution to Tottenham Hotspur in the 90s is referenced within the book. And I said about having Stockholm Syndrome a little bit. I've grown an even more affection for the period, for the players, for the results, for the experiences as it went through, having written it. And if anyone who reads it gets half as much fun reading it as I did researching it and writing it, then you'd have had a good experience. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about it on air, Ricky.
I must reading through it. It is brilliantly done, because each season begins with a your view of what the season is and what it's to become, which sets the scene from a fan. Then you go through the season from the factual point of view. Like I say, there's a brilliant, the appendix gives you all the results and the finishing positions and that who won what that season and where we finished and top goal scorers and things. So you do get a fascinating look. And like I say, it's so many things that it just feels like yesterday to me. But it was despite the nightmare scenarios that it did, it was actually fun, and it is brilliant to cross-reference it to what happens now. So, like I said, we just had that snapshot on Teletext shows you that no new signings, and here we are in the middle of June, and yet we're going to end up as the next Manchester City. So many things happen today, and then there's so many polar opposites that you can relate to today. It's just a great book, and you don't have to have been in the 90s to thoroughly enjoy it. You will definitely enjoy the period. but we'll probably never have Alan Sugar on Last Word at Spurs after tonight.
Well, listen, Lee's got anything to do about it. Look, I just want to close it. Absolutely. I just want to close it back out for this little bit of a segment from Julie Welsh from The Forward, who says, this fantastically interesting and forensically researched book does a marvellous job of recreating the drama, suspense, heartache, excitement and sheer fun of being a Spurs fan back then, which I thought was great words there from Julie, of course, friend of the show. Gareth, just a final plug if we can. Book obviously coming out for those next week. Just a reminder of the release date, where they can buy the book. And as you do that, for the people that are watching this show actually via YouTube, we're going to share that QR code to do so.
Yep, for sure. So, I mean, Amazon is your go-to, I guess, for people internationally. They will get the book to you wherever you are in the world. If you're in the UK, I've set up my own personal selling site, which you see there's a QR code for on there as well. I mean, if in doubt, follow me on Twitter. So I think my Twitter handle has been visible here. It's at Gareth Dace. You find me on Twitter. I only comment on anything 90s Spurs related on there, but you'll find on there, on my pinned tweet, the website that you can buy that through.
Amazing. Look, Gareth, you're not going to leave this. I've actually had a lot of fun doing this show. I don't think maybe I would because of where I'm revisiting back to, but I think it's a constant reminder of kind of when you're looking at Spurs today, God, things were a lot worse. So hopefully, guys, it's been the perfect kind of therapy again for you as we get up to another feature special on the weekend. But I want to say a massive thanks as always to Jason, who is the architect and brains behind making these kind of shows. Jace, thank you as always.
That's all right, mate. It was, like I say, it was a nightmare, but a fun read. Not a nightmare because of the way the book's written, but just the memories and the traumas that it brings back. But that was another thoroughly enjoyable show, and great to catch up with Gareth as well.
Absolutely. Gareth, I want to say a massive thank you again. We're also going to put all the details of how those in the UK can purchase the book and overseas in our episode description on audio. So don't panic, guys. We'll be doing that for you as well. Gareth, last but not least, thank you so much. Really enjoyed having you on Last One on Spurs. Thank you again.
Pleasure. It's absolutely delighted to be here. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
No, listen, pleasure's all ours. Look,
and
from
I was
myself
going
and
to say as well, if you're a lawyer, can you send me your details? Because I might need it. John Wenham's, Lily White Rose is a lawyer, isn't he? I'll get John on my case.
We might need to bring Lee back in with Alan. Maybe it could be getting that bad. Listen, I want to say a massive thank you to Jason McGovern, to the wonderful Gareth Dace. Guys, have been the Last One on Spurs. We'll be back with you very, very soon. As always, thanks so much for all the support. And as always, come on, you Spurs.